If everyone is ready, my 7 minutes can start now. It is because we fundamentally believe that workers' rights in the United States are constantly on a decline, and we have to protect the people who cannot protect themselves without labor unions, that we are proud to affirm that the United States federal government should lift its ban on secondary boycotts. First, I would like to start off with some definitions before I go into observations and then contentions. Our definition for secondary boycott is industrial action by a union taken against a company on grounds that it does business with another company engaged in labor disputes. We observe that this will be implemented after the effects of COVID are already over, so we don't see the economic detriments, and we can implement it from like a fresh start. The value in this round is going to be workers' rights because they're going to be the ones that are most affected by this like policy that we enact, and they're the ones that are like having their rights taken away in the status quo. So we should look towards protecting their rights first. Now let's move into contentions. Contention 1 is that unionizing is beneficial for workers' rights. Subpoint A is that unions are statistically proven to increase workers' wages and workers' rights. We see that workers' wages and workers' rights are really important in protecting the rights of these workers, and we see that there's a direct correlation with like how well the company performs and like workers' wages and satisfaction of the workers. When we also see that like when we have unions, these are like statistically proven to increase overall like happiness of the workers and to increase wages and satisfaction amongst a company. Subpoint B is that they're necessary for reform. We see that primary protests don't often actually solve for the workers' rights abuses that we see, especially because companies don't have a direct incentive to solve for this. For example, large corporations don't have a direct incentive if all of the people from that union protested, because they have the funds and the resources to just fire all of the workers protesting for their rights and then hire new workers. We also see that this is really problematic because it means that we perpetuate the abuse that workers face, and secondary boycotts are uniquely beneficial because what they do is they provide pressure from third-party companies onto that company in order to resolve these workers' rights abuses. A subpoint C here is going to be secondary protests uniquely give companies a chance for reform. The United States Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that only 10.8% of workers are part of labor unions. We see that this is a complete decline from what used to be about 10 years ago, and we see that this decline is largely due in part because people do not believe in the total effectiveness of these unions. Insofar as like these people, like this 10.8%, there's been a reduction. This reduction is really problematic because the more workers there are in unions, the stronger the union. We see that secondary boycotts are uniquely beneficial in having an increase in labor unions and participation in these labor unions. Subpoint D is going to be race. Almost 2/3 of all of the people in these unions are minorities, people of color, and women. What this means is that unions are uniquely beneficial for them. In order to resolve these rights abuses for the people who are already being oppressed and marginalized in society, we need to be able to have secondary boycotts. Secondary boycotts make unions more powerful and give them another tool in the toolbox in order to solve and fight back for workers' abuses. We also see that empirics prove that when we have secondary boycotts, labor union participation increases. We can look to the example of Syria, where it has secondary unions. Look to the fact that like labor force participation has increased by 200,000 since it has been implemented. This is really important because what we see is that when there's increased workers in these labor unions, there's more of a chance for them to fight back against these abuses. Contention 2 is that it violates the First Amendment. Subpoint A is that they are a non-violent form of protest. Insofar as labor unions are like secondary boycotts are a form of non-violent protests that are specifically used to like help ensure workers' rights, there is no reason for the federal government to keep this ban. For example, these like protests are not uniquely like causing mass paranoia or mass hysteria like you would if you were yelling like fire in a crowded theater. There's no actual reason to ban this because they're just a non-violent form of protest. Subpoint B here is that it's a slippery slope into taking away further rights. We see that a lot of the people working in these unions or part of these unions are again minorities and people of color and women, people who have like historically been oppressed and silenced by the government. Insofar as like once we lift this ban, we help give these people a voice. We contend that this ban is another way to silence these voices who are already being marginalized in society. Subpoint C is going to be corporation resources. So we see that corporations already have extensive resources when it comes to lobbying power, and they already have a lot of say in governmental policies. This is really problematic because insofar as these people have a lot of say in what actually like gets passed on Capitol Hill, union workers on the other hand, and people who actually are doing the like hard work are not actually getting a say in the government. And it's really bad because union workers don't have that same influence. We see that unions are uniquely necessary in order for these workers to be able to have and maintain their rights and to be able to have representation in the society that we live in. Insofar as corporations have so much power, secondary boycotts are another way for union workers to be able to have a say in society. This leads me into contention 3 of economic inequality. Subpoint A is that the United States the top 1% of the people in the United States own 99% of the wealth. This literally proves that there is high income economic inequalities, which are really, really bad for solving back for structural oppression and for solving back for the wage gap. We see that unions are uniquely beneficial in helping and alleviating this economic inequality and changing this income gap. And we see that workers are because unions are going down, we also see a direct correlation between decrease in workers' rights and decrease in union participation. And insofar as there's high economic inequality in the status quo in the United States, it is a unique reason to vote Gov, because right now, if we lifted the ban, we would be solving back for this economic inequality, because we would A, be redistributing the wealth through these protests, because these corporations would lose direct money for having human rights violations, and B, because insofar as these workers are now going to be able to have more of a say in the workplace that they live in, they're going to have more representation. We also see that this impacts out to A, closing the wealth gap, and B, voter suppression. We see that it helps uniquely in closing the wealth gap because, again, these workers are now going to be able to actually get the wages that they deserve and get the rights that they deserve. But B, we contend that it also helps solve for voter suppression, because a lot of the times the people who are actually getting represented on Capitol Hill, again, are the large corporations who have a lot of money. And the way that we solve for this and the way that we actually provide legitimacy to our democracy is if these people also get a say in the government and in the world that we live in. Subpoint B is going to be that the impacts of the wealth gap. We contend that we outweigh on cyclical oppression, because we see that if these people are already poor to start off with, and their labor, the places that they're working on are not helping solve back for this poverty, then we contend that it's going to be generational and it's going to be really bad, because insofar as these people are going to be poor, they're not going to be able to provide for their children. They're going to stay in poverty, and it's not going to be beneficial, because now they're going to be it's going to be a continued cyclical cycle of oppression. Thus, I'm proud to affirm.
Okay, cool. So really quick, let me get my spreadsheet tabs in order. The order will be 2 off, so 2 neg arguments, and then the aff case in order. Is everyone ready? Yes? Okay, cool. So with that, my time starts now. Going straight into the first disadvantage is going to be called economy. What you're going to see is, under the uniqueness, the first point is that secondary boycotts can hurt small businesses. What we see is that small businesses constitute a major force in the United States economy. There are more than 27 million small businesses in this country, and they generate about 50% of our GDP, and that is taken from a little while ago, and after COVID-19 hit, it's possible that they contribute a lot more than that. The ban on secondary boycotts currently protects these businesses from being harmed if one of their major suppliers is being boycotted against. The second point underneath the uniqueness is that real-life companies have been hurt. What you're seeing is that consumers have pressured Israel to end its West Bank occupation by boycotting Israeli companies that support the government through taxes. Activists have targeted Arizona businesses for funding their states through immigration laws, and the Mississippi-based American Family Association has used secondary boycotts against the likes of Ford and McDonald's to hamper what it regards as a pro-LGBTQ kind of community that the companies allegedly helped sponsor through advertisements and membership. So what you're seeing is that through these secondary boycotts, there were a lot of companies that ended up being hurt, even though they didn't really deserve that, or there were situations where these boycotts shouldn't have applied. So what you're going to see on the link level is, number one, the plan is going to put small businesses at risk. The little A here is that if a small business receives product from a major company whose CEO says something offensive, repealing this law would allow organizations or unions to boycott and protest the small business as a whole, not just the CEO, but the entire small business. That means every single worker, every single person there is going to have to suffer, even though they have no control of what happens at the top or what their supplier says. The second link is that this is going to prevent inter-business partnerships if you vote AF, because companies are going to be more and more wary of partnering with other companies in fear of secondary boycotts, which means small businesses are just not going to get those opportunities anymore, and they are going to inevitably suffer. On the impacts, you're going to see, obviously, number one, unemployment. If small businesses suffer, those people are definitely going to get laid off. Those businesses could completely close, and unemployment is the number one cause of poverty in the United States. The second impact here is going to be the economy. As we state, small businesses are extremely important to the economy, especially during the pandemic and the ways that we're trying to rebuild ourselves. So what you're going to see is inter-business partnerships are key to a strong and innovative economy, and we need to make sure that we uphold that economy so that everyone is able to kind of continue having their jobs. But onto the second disadvantage, this one is going to be called worker rights. What you're going to see under the uniqueness is, number one, employers used to use their power over employees to classify them as supervisors or independent contractors in order to prevent them from being union eligible. This is a tactic that a lot of these employers used to use in order to keep people out of a union, because they realized that these unions were getting too strong for them to combat anymore. The only reason this actually stopped, according to BBC, is because of the secondary boycotts being banned. That was the one action that caused employers to take a step back and say, okay, now we are not going to do this anymore, because obviously we don't need to worry about that. Essentially, when the ban was limited, employers weren't holding that power over their employees. If you think of it from a business perspective, if a business wants to work with Apple, for example, but Apple is in the midst of details with Amazon, where there are worker protests and all of these things happening, the secondary protest allows the workers to say, no, we aren't going to work with Amazon. The problem with that is all of the CEOs and major businesses, this kind of goes on the first disadvantage, they are the ones who should be kind of punished for wanting to deal with all of these other ones who might have these labor issues, but all of the workers are going to be the ones who are going to struggle, because if you lift the ban, that's immediately going to have all of these companies' CEOs punishing the workers, saying, okay, well, now your union's too strong, so we're taking away your power to even join a union. That means any of the AF impacts, which I'll get into in a minute, about how these workers are going to be strong and these unions are going to go strong, are just not going to flow through. I'll take it at the end of my speech if I have time. Sorry, I have a lot to get through. But all of these workers are just not going to have the power that they kind of argue they will. So on the link level, if you are going to vote AF and lift the ban, workers are definitely going to get laid off more and not be allowed to join unions. That's a power that these employers are going to hold over them. That means that secondary boycotts won't even work in the AF world, because they require strong unions, but the AF plan makes it impossible for all of these workers to join unions to begin with. Workers not getting benefits means that's going to that's going to hurt their quality of life. They're not going to have a good enough job. They're not going to have those medical benefits that they need at a time we're in a pandemic. So on the impact level, you're going to see number one of worker rights and quality of life. You're going to see, once again, unemployment, which again is the number one cause of poverty. This is an impact you should weigh on magnitude, because so much of the population is struggling from unemployment at a time where we're stuck in a pandemic, and that is going to win in the short and long term on when you're judging the impacts on which ones are big and which ones are small. On the top of case, the AF comes up, we agree with their definitions, but then they tell you that their plan is to do this, but after COVID's effects are over. This is a fatal flaw in the AF's plan, because we don't know who declares when the effects of COVID are over, right? They say that, oh, after the effects of COVID are over, that's the best time to do the plan. Who is going to say that? Is it we just go ahead and believe that maybe the effects are over because I say so or because they say so? We don't know how that's going to happen. Does that mean that the economy is going to be 100% rebuilt? Does that mean that the economy is going to be higher than what we left it at? We have no idea what that means, and therefore that means on their time frame, you cannot guarantee that their plan is going to work, because we don't know when it's going to happen. So that's going to be a huge issue. Also, on their weighing mechanism, they say worker rights. We agree worker rights matter, but we think as the judge, you should be weighing this round on net benefits, which is basically the most amount of good for most amount of people. This is best because the businesses that these workers are working for are also going to be influencing the economy, and the economy affects everybody, right? So we think that you should be prioritizing kind of the entire country, but even if you want to go under their weighing mechanism, we'll still win that one, and we'll explain that throughout the round. On these specific advantages. On their first advantage of worker rights, you can basically turn this advantage, right? We tell you a lot of statistics as to how this specific boycotting was already hurting worker rights and will hurt worker rights. We give you enough warranting to show that, but you can see that also they tell you about how secondary boycotts are uniquely beneficial for unions. Again, this isn't even true, right? The unions are not going to exist if workers aren't allowed to join. But secondly, you can see that there are different kinds of boycotts allowed. For example, a primary boycott is a boycott by a labor union and its members to stop consumers from using, purchasing, and transporting a particular employer's or specific company's products, goods, or services. This is
POI.
already a boycott. I don't have time, sorry. This is already a boycott that exists in the status quo and will continue to exist, which means workers and these unions do have the power to speak up and get the rights that they think they deserve. And they do have the power to influence companies. But the secondary boycott specifically was harming the workers, which is why the ban needs to stay. We give you enough evidence to prove that, so you can just turn this entire argument. Yeah, on the second advantage, constitutionality, they don't really prove why this is unconstitutional. They don't tell you specific amendments that this is like not abiding by. But anyways, they kind of say that there's no reason to ban this. And so that means that it's unconstitutional. But we give you reasons to ban it, right? Look to the disadvantages. Extend the fact that employers were using this ban to abuse the power that they have over this employees. Extend the fact that after the ban was implemented, this stopped happening. That means doing the app is actually going to hurt the workers. Yeah, on to their third advantage. On economic inequality, they kind of just argue that there's going to be redistributing of wealth and that the wages are going to be split up more equally. Number one, secondary boycotts don't do that. There's no way for them to guarantee that will happen. If you look towards their definition of secondary boycotts, that is not in the definition. That is just like the boycotts are just like saying, hey, we don't want you to work with these companies specifically. It's not saying you need to split up the wealth equally between every single worker here, regardless of their race or identity. So while we think that is an important issue, it's not one that the app is going to solve for. And again, when we tell you that these employers are going to lay off their workers, who do you think those workers are going to be? Normally, they are those minority workers who are Black or Latino people, which means, again, the app is actually going to be doing this worse, meaning that you turn this argument and vote no. Thank you.
Okay. Is everyone ready? Awesome. Time starts now. The biggest mistake the opposition makes in this round is failing to acknowledge the fact that unions help workers, not hurt them. But let's go down first the disadvantages. So first, on the first disadvantage of the economy, they talk about how secondary boycotts hurt small businesses, but there's no link here because small businesses don't even face fights with unions. It's mostly like big corporations, and they don't even have like a lot of workers that they can have like secondary boycotts with. But thirdly, they didn't actually tell you how many small businesses like actually violate workers' rights. They just tell you like it's going to hurt small businesses in general. But secondly, they talk about interbusiness partnerships and how they're going to go down. But you can turn this because this is actually a good thing. If we're going to see less corporations like working with other corporations that have bad labor practices, it's going to mean that it's going to mean a win for workers' rights. Because if Apple sees that Amazon is like abusing its workers and it's not going to like work with Amazon, I would argue that's a good thing. But second, they talk about how this is all going to impact out to unemployment, which leads to poverty. But literally, this is a non-unique argument because at the end of the day, even when we see that unemployment is low, we're still seeing people facing poverty because of the fact that unions aren't strong enough in the status quo and they don't have wages that are high enough in order for them to live like above the poverty line or like live a decent life even with jobs. So jobs don't have an impact unless they actually have high enough wages. And the only side that gives workers the ability to get those high enough wages to live like a decent life is going to be the government side. But let's go down to like the second disadvantage of workers' rights. They talk about how they talk about the BBC like article that said like these secondary boycotts like harmed workers, but literally like you can't just in parliamentary debate you can't just use a source and say the source said something and like not explain why it happened. Like they didn't actually explain like how workers were actually punished, and their only argument here was like companies stopped like workers from joining unions, but that's literally illegal according to section 17 of the national like labor relation law, everyone has the legal right to join a union. Like companies can't stop them from doing that. So that's just false. And in fact, in states like Georgia, there's a right to work law which prohibits interference with employment to compel any person to join or refrain from joining a union. So there's already laws in place that prevent such things from happening. So workers can't be punished. But then let's go on to the government case. First, on the top, they tell you that like we don't know what it looks like when the after effects of COVID are gone, but we clearly explain like it means that we have like herd it, like I think that's like pretty logical. If you have herd immunity and like businesses are open again, then we would all agree that like the effects of COVID-19 are over. And we all know when things are over, like in terms of the economy, we know the 2008 recession is over. We know the Great Depression is over. These are just facts. But then let's go on to the value debate. We talk about the value of workers' rights, and they say we should weigh this frown on net benefits. But the fact of the matter is that when we're talking about unions, it's about big corporations work versus workers. And we made it pretty clear in our case that big corporations already have enough power, which means we should focus on workers if we need to maximize net benefits. But then let's go on to contention one of benefiting workers. They just cross applied like their own disadvantage here. So you can cross apply my responses. But also on subpoint B, on like the contention one overall, they talked about how primary boycotts like still exist, but we're seeing in the status quo that primary boycotts don't work. If you look towards subpoint C, we can see that only 10.8% of people are part of labor unions. And they also conceded the fact that in Syria, when they implemented secondary boycotts, it actually increased like labor force participation, which not only like turns their argument of unemployment, but shows you how we're actually benefiting workers. But secondly, they talked about how unions won't exist in the government world. But again, you can cross-apply what I said before. It's illegal for a company to prevent you from joining a union. And at the end of the day, joining a union is the right to every worker. So that's just like a false argument. You can extend contention one. You can extend subpoint D in contention one, which is really important because we talk about how 2/3 of unions and two-thirds of unions are people of color and people of color and women, which is really important because, again, in contention three, we talked about the economic inequality argument, but I'll reference that later. But at the end of the day, when you extend contention one, you need to remember one thing: unions right now aren't powerful. We can see that with the way we're seeing like this decrease in labor force participation and a decrease in participation of labor unions. What we're trying to do in the government side is to increase the power of unions, which is what secondary boycotts do. What they do in the opposition world is like create this scenario where unions become super powerful and they prevent like interbusiness partnerships, or they prevent like companies from doing things that they want to do. But at the end of the day, unions aren't even powerful enough in the status quo to get like basic wage increases and to get wage increases to the point where like at least their workers won't live in poverty. So clearly the opposition side is giving unions way more power than they have in the status quo, and way more power than they can even get with secondary boycotts. But then let's go on to contention two of the First Amendment. Their only response here is that they're giving you reasons why the First Amendment should be violated in the status quo. But according to like Supreme Court cases and the Constitution, the only way the First Amendment the only way for the First Amendment gets should be violate or should be like is okay to be violated is if it causes panic. For example, like shouting fire in a crowded theater, or if you like damage someone's reputation, like libel. And none of those things, or damage someone's reputation in a false way, and none of those things are happening like with secondary boycotts. It's simply workers like using their right to express themselves through how they're purchasing like products and how they want to like protest against these corporations. So at the end of the day, they haven't given you a single reason why we should violate the First Amendment. And insofar as we both agree that the First Amendment is like a right that every American, regardless of whether they're a worker or corporation, should have, then that's an independent reason to vote government. But also going back to contention one, when they talked about primary boycotts, also look towards the fact that this like they basically are turning like their own case, because insofar as like primary boycotts exist, they're the ones that can actually hurt small businesses, because primary boycotts are for like directly hurting the company in order to get gains, but secondary boycotts aren't as applicable to small businesses because they don't even use like suppliers. They're usually like small businesses because they work like on their own. So we hurt small businesses less. But then going back to like the government case. You can also extend subpoint C of contention 2, which is really important because we talked about how corporations have so much lobbying power in the status quo, which is really important because the only way workers like gain more rights or they gain like any power is by increasing the power of unions. And insofar as corporations already have so much lobbying power, there's no way they're going to be harmed by secondary boycotts. The government side is just leveling the playing field. They're not hurting corporations. But then let's go to contention 3 of economic inequality. You can also extend this. Again, this is really important because economic inequality is a huge issue in the status quo. And it's especially bad because, as Shruti said, the second impact of this contention is the cyclical oppression that happens. So not only like are these minorities and these like low income communities harmed by the lack of power that they have, but it becomes cyclical because they never gain any benefits and they are never able to like, there's a lack of like economic mobilization. And the opposition side only response here is that we're just going to like lay off workers, or the corporations are going to lay off workers because like unions are going to become too strong. But again, you can cross-apply what I said before on their disadvantage, but also remember that it's literally illegal for them to do that. But thirdly, remember that these corporations aren't going to lay off workers for simple rights. It's going to be like negotiations, and the negotiations can't happen unless there's a level playing field, which the government side provides. Thus, I affirm.
Okay, so I'm the second speaker on the neg in terms of order. I'll be going over the negations, two disadvantages or two arguments, then the background and like the affirmation plan, and then the two affirmation arguments.
Sounds good. Can you just remind us of your name?
Sure, my name is Abhishiva.
Perfect, thanks.
Okay.
I'm good when everyone else is.
Yep, is anyone not ready? Awesome, okay. And with that, my time starts now. So first, on a quick overview of the case, the negation wins the debate here today for two reasons. Number one, while the affirmation does highlight the importance of unions and workers' rights, they don't prove or really explain to you how secondary boycotts uniquely help unions. And the second reason we win is because the negation is the one that proves that secondary boycotts are more likely to hurt a lot more businesses and employers than it helps. And that is why it has been banned for over 70 years now, and why the courts have like consistently upheld this ruling. On to the first disadvantage. Our opponents essentially make three main responses. Number one, they say that small businesses don't face fights with unions. Yes, while we agree that small businesses don't have unions, that's not the argument we're making here. Essentially, this allows unions that are striking against big companies to retaliate and strike against all the small businesses that this partner contracts with, which means that even though small businesses don't have unions, they can be affected by the big companies that do have unions and whose workers are striking against those companies, which essentially means that any big company who works with small businesses who does some kind of bad thing, that means all the small businesses they work with will now be susceptible to retaliation. Go ahead.
Why would big corporations use small businesses?
Okay, well then, let me make this analysis then. Say that I am a small business, right? I'm a small business owner and I have a supplier that's like a really big business, right? They're my supplier, and I actually have something here. Yeah, okay, so if I'm a small business and my supplier, some kind of big company did something wrong and labor unions are now protesting them. Well, the fact is, like, just because my supplier did something wrong doesn't mean that me and my worker should have to suffer for it. The fact is, large suppliers can wait out boycotts, but small businesses definitely cannot. And that's like the fundamental flaw in your plan. Essentially, it allows the unions that are retaliating against their big businesses to now start to like direct their attention to all the small businesses that like this big business is a supplier to. So continue on the first, I'll take it at the end of the argument. So moving on to the second refutation that they say is that they don't tell you how many small businesses like violate workers' rights. We are not saying that small businesses are violating workers' rights. We're saying that small businesses will be affected when big business unions strike against those businesses and essentially like comes into their territory afterwards just because of their neutral association with that business. Moving on to their third response, they say if Apple sees that Amazon abuses its workers and chooses not to partner with Amazon, that's a good thing. I would agree that that's a good thing, but our opponents are only assuming that secondary boycotts only affect big businesses when that's simply not the case. Moving on to actually their fourth argument, just about how it's like non-unique because unemployment and poverty happen all the time. Well, like, yeah, we do agree that unemployment and poverty happen, but the fact is you like further bite into that and further amplify it because you will be like unnecessarily allowing small businesses to be affected by like large unions that are protesting like completely other businesses. And this is like a consistent theme that our opponents have dropped in this argument, and like they just don't understand that link between small businesses and big businesses, and for those reasons, you can't vote for this argument, and you are going to uphold the negation's first advantage about the economy and extend all the impacts about how unemployment is going to rise because small businesses suffer, and the economy is going to suffer because like businesses just don't want to partner with each other anymore. Moving on to our second disadvantage, our opponents essentially have two main responses. Number one, they say that our opponents are like anti-union, they don't want workers' rights, but like, again, we are definitely not anti-union. We tell you that primary boycotts are like definitely something that everyone should be engaged in, but we want to say that unions should not be able to like direct their attention to small businesses who are like completely neutral parties and essentially hurt small businesses just because they have like some quarrel with a big business. Moving on to their second response, that anyone can join unions and employers stopping that is illegal, but that's how it should be. But employers like obviously take advantage of the loopholes, and my partner just like makes that analysis, and our opponents definitely don't give you enough analysis to prove otherwise. Moving on to the plan and like some of the quarrels in terms of the plan. So first, in terms of their like, we'll do it after the pandemic ends. And my partner brings up a very important analysis here, is that like, who determines when the pandemic ends? Our opponents say like, oh, you know, like we all know when stuff ends, like the recession ended, but like, are we going to start implementing this plan once we reach herd immunity? Are we going to start implementing this plan once our economy has reached a certain point at like post-pandemic levels? Like we never know when this plan passes. Therefore, like how do you pass a plan that doesn't have like an actual set time frame? This is just one of the solvency deficits to passing their plan. And moving on to the second key flaw in their like background information and resolution analysis is that they tell you that the weighing mechanism is workers' rights. Judge, we're in parliamentary debate and we are role-playing as policymakers. Never do policymakers only consider the result of a policy action for one group. As policymakers, it is our role to weigh all the benefits for all the parties involved. That's simply how policymaking works. And since they are role-playing as the United States federal government, they should act as United States federal government policymakers. And just like all policymaking decisions, they should weigh it on net benefits, the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people. And that is a clear reason to prefer our weighing mechanism over theirs. Moving on to some responses on their case. On their first advantage and their first argument, they essentially extend this workers' rights argument with one main extension. They say that it's worked in Syria where workers joined unions after they allowed secondary boycotts and all was good. But we have two responses to this. Number one, like our opponents said in their speech, you can't just give us some evidence or statistic without explaining it at all. All we have is this claim that Syrian labor unions were strengthened, but they don't explain how secondary boycotts had anything to do with that. Our second response is that the House of Representatives just recently passed the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, just like my partner states, which prevents employees from stifling unions and retaliating against employees who strike, which again just proves that they don't solve for anything here. And our third response to this actually is that secondary boycotts don't help benefit unions because just intuitively it doesn't make sense how they would do that. Like, sure, it may increase the power of unions by just allowing them to secondary boycott, but in no way does this help like workers of these unions because like, I don't know, I guess now they'd just be boycotting against some other companies, but there's no incentive as to how this would like increase union membership or like improve that in any case. All we have is that it like worked in Syria without any analysis as to how it worked in Syria. Therefore, we can't just believe that it's going to work here because there's no analysis, and we can't just go over like some statistic that they claim it works, because that's just not how parliamentary debate works. So in terms of a quick underview on the first advantage, which is like their biggest advantage, the analysis that I made earlier is that if I'm a small business who is a supplier, who has a big business supplier that does something wrong, I should not have to suffer for it, because large suppliers can wait at boycotts, but small businesses definitely cannot, especially during times of pandemics or really in the real world. And when we give you statistics about the importance of small businesses, how they're the employers of like over half the American population, we must take into account the effects that small businesses will face just because like some labor unions have some quarrel with the larger business. So yes, This plan does increase the power of unions. It allows them to secondary boycott, but not in the way that helps workers' rights. It only results in other workers in other industries or other companies or smaller businesses suffer because of the action of like one big company that unions are trying to organize against. Moving on to their second argument about constitutionality. Their first response is that it's unconstitutional and people should be able to protest. Two responses. Number one, we are not anti-First Amendment at all. This law bans labor unions from forming organized and targeted protests against neutral third parties. I, as an individual, can do whatever I want. This law does not prevent me from doing that, but I, as a labor union, cannot directly target these like smaller secondary boycotts. And our second response is that this ban on secondary boycotts was passed 70 years ago, and it has been upheld in the court several times. So this unconstitutional argument is simply a wash. Moving on to their second extension in the second argument is that they say unions are weak and corporations are too powerful, but it isn't only big businesses that are affected by this plan, it's small businesses as well, which again constitute a majority of the workforce. And finally, on their third argument, they say that we provide a level playing field, but the fact is you just like worsen the playing field even more when smaller businesses have to suffer through long boycotts, which they can't stand just because a big business that they do relationships with did something wrong or the CEO said something bad. So for those reasons, in terms of net benefits, the true weighing mechanism in this round, you have to think that does repealing secondary boycotts provide the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people? And I hope we prove to you that it does not. For those reasons, vote opposition.
All right, I think we're ready for op rebuttal.
Yep. All right. So I think if you're flowing, you can just do it on a new sheet because I'll just be going over kind of a little bit of a summary of everything and talking about why we believe the neg should win in this round. Okay, is everyone ready? Okay, sounds good. So with that, my time starts now. Really quick, just look at the definition the AF provides to you in the first speech, right? I bring this up in my first speech, and this is something that's really, really important. Their definition is literally an industrial action by a union taken on a company on grounds that it does business with another company. Where here do you see that this helps with wealth distribution or worker rights? When you look at this, there's literally no way they can solve any worker rights impact, so disregard any arguments they make about that in the PMR. There is literally no way they do that because at the end of the day, we give you evidence to show that the plan itself is something that, like, we banned this in the first place to help worker rights. There was a really big issue of employers stopping people from joining unions, and we tell you this time and time again, but they still think that the plan is a good idea. Their own definition knocks out both of their main arguments. Also, on their constitutionality argument, extend like my partner's responses he just made, banning this was not unconstitutional. In fact, it's morally correct if we make sure that we help the workers and allow them to be joining the unions because they're right. In the status quo, not in the status quo, back when this wasn't banned, the employers that were like making all of these people unable to join the unions, that was illegal. Yeah, that was a bad thing. But after the ban was implemented, that is when that stopped. That means that it is better to vote neg in order to make sure that these employers aren't doing those illegal things. So that takes out all of their offense. The only thing they really have left is their plan, right? Maybe. But extend the response I make in the LLC about how we don't know when the COVID effects will end. My partner just talks about that too. There is no way that they can just come up here and tell you that everybody is going to come to a common consensus on that. There are two judges in the back of the room right now. One of you could have a different idea of this than the other. I could have a different idea of it. They don't say that any specific person or organization is going to say it. They don't say the World Health Organization. They don't say the CDC. It is far too vague. It's just a bad time frame. There's no reason to buy that the plan on probability will actually solve for anything. Then they act like passing this is a really, really big deal, but it's just not something that you should be buying when it's way too vague for you to actually gauge the effects of the plan. At the end of the day, because of that, you are going to vote neg for a few reasons. Number one, whether or not you want to evaluate this round on worker rights or net benefits, we're going to win, right? On worker rights, they essentially drop the argument that we continuously tell you about how before the ban, employers weren't even letting people join unions. They call us out for saying that we don't think unions are strong enough. We do. We think unions are amazing, and we do think that boycotting when needed is good, which is why we tell you primary boycotts are good. Extend the arguments that we make on primary boycotts are solving. They barely talk to you about this. They just say, no, secondary boycotts are needed. They don't tell you why they are better than primary boycotts. They don't tell you why secondary boycotts are needed, which is why they literally cannot be winning on worker rights because primary boycotts are solving. Unions are strong enough, and we can have primary boycotts and have those worker rights exist. The secondary boycotts just get rid of all of that. So then on the net benefits evaluation, we think that is the best way to do it. Extend my partner's response. It's just a realistic point of view, right? Policymakers are always going to be looking at everybody. When we are going for impacts such as economy, worker rights, and all of these plans that we're solving, workers feed into the economy. The economy affects everybody. That means what should we be evaluating? Who does the most amount of good? Who solves for the most amount of impacting and actually shows that they can do something that is going to benefit a lot of people, right? On scope, on magnitude, the only people in this round who try to prove that is the neg. We give you analysis on how unemployment is the #1 cause of poverty. We tell you that in this time right now, COVID-19, and even if you want to buy that like after the effects of COVID-19, this is a good idea, there's still going to be people in poverty. We don't want to allow those people to just get more and more. We don't want poverty to become worse and worse. And for those reasons, this should be a clear vote on the neg. Thank you.
Okay. Is everyone ready for my last speech? Okay.
Yes.
So brief off-time roadmap. The order will just be like going down voters on the opposition flow and then moving on to the government. Starting off with like the framework debate though. You can flow framework on Gov though. Is everyone ready? Okay, cool. If everyone is good, we can start time now. Overview. The biggest concession the opposition makes is that they concede that secondary boycotts do actually strengthen unions. They specifically tell you in their like first opposition rebuttal that unions are strengthened by secondary boycott. They just say, quote unquote, it's not in the way that like we expect it to. Insofar as we prove that unions are being strengthened by secondary boycotts and they increase labor force participation, it is an automatic vote for the Gov because we control the internal link in as to how we solve for human rights abuses under labor unions. But now let's move on to voters. The first voter is going to be framework. We specifically tell you to look towards workers' rights because they are the ones impacted by this motion, and they are the ones that like the government has been failing to protect. They really make this response that like we don't like the government should never looks towards like just one group of people. They look towards everyone, but that's exactly the problem. When we look towards everyone, we often ignore the rights of these workers. We constantly keep oppressing the group that is already marginalized in society, which means we should only be looking towards union workers' rights. This is really important because they tell you that like the government always makes policies in a certain way. Sure, the government used to make policies that were racist. Does that mean that that was the right thing to do? We contend that morally it is the right thing to specifically look towards like people who are most impacted by the policy and people who are already cyclically oppressed in society. For example, they tell you just because the government makes a policy in a certain way doesn't mean it's the right thing to do, which means you should specifically be looking towards union workers. This is really important because this has multiple implications. One, it means don't buy any of their arguments about small businesses because they are not part of unions. We specifically tell you that like we're looking towards union rights, which means you shouldn't be looking towards their impacts about small businesses and like especially like their impacts about like how small businesses are harmed.
I'm going to stop time at 3:15 because I think we lost audio connection. Last sentence we heard was, even though small businesses are harmed.
Sorry? Wait, sorry, I couldn't hear you. Could you?
Yeah, so we lost you after you said even though small businesses are harmed, and you had 3 minutes, 15 seconds left.
Oh, okay. All right. Should I start back at 3:30 to re-explain the argument?
That works.
Okay? Okay, cool. I can resume time. Wait, sorry. Do you mean 3:30 with grace or like without grace?
Without.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. So if everyone is ready, we can resume time. Now, we contend that even if small businesses are harmed, they are technically not what we're looking towards in this debate. The value here is supposed to be specifically union workers' rights, which means you should only be evaluating. Sure.
Stop time. The argument that the weighing mechanism is union worker rights is new in the last speech because the first two speeches, it was just worker rights, which would just apply to any worker. So we would just point of order that like phrasing or that weighing mechanism of specifically union worker rights.
Sure. So we already made like the analysis that like we specifically talked about like workers' rights, but we said the union workers are the ones who are most benefited by the policy or like impacted. So we should be looking towards them, but like it's up to the judge's discretion. It's fine. Okay. But now I'm at like 3:49, including grace. So if everyone is ready, I can resume time. Now, let's move on to the first off voter here. The first is that we specifically tell you that secondary boycotts do not harm small businesses. We make 4 arguments here. 1, we tell you that primary boycotts literally do the same thing. They don't tell you why secondary boycotts are unique in harming these small businesses. And we make this analysis in our last speech, and then it goes conceded. We specifically tell you that primary boycotts also do the same thing, which means that there's no actual argument here. The second argument is that they're in a double bind. Either these businesses are large enough to continue supplying even through these secondary boycotts, or they won't be boycotted in the first place because they can see that only large businesses are the ones that are actually boycotted, which means if these businesses are small enough, then they're not going to be boycotted. The third argument we make is that we specifically talk about how we should be looking towards workers' rights and not a whole business as a whole. And fourth, we specifically tell you that small businesses don't actually use large businesses for suppliers, and large businesses don't rely on small businesses. So there's no actual overlap here. This is really important because the fourth argument here goes conceded. We specifically tell you that large businesses don't look towards small businesses, and small businesses usually are supplied domestically or within smaller businesses, which means that insofar as small businesses don't impact large businesses and large businesses don't overlap with small businesses, you shouldn't flow this argument. But now the second argument here about boycotting and how it doesn't work. First, they give you no warranting as to why union workers are people are going to be just laid off. Second, we specifically tell you that it's illegal in the status quo, and they give you only one example where this has happened. Look towards the fact that it's not widespread where companies just start laying off workers, especially union workers. You should outweigh on probability here, especially because Georgia literally just passed the right to work law, which forbids all interference, and their evidence doesn't have a time frame, so we can look to the fact that if their evidence is outdated, there's new laws in place that uniquely protect workers' rights. Now let's move on to gov voters. So the second reason you're going to be voting gov in this debate is going to be the first contention. We specifically tell you that being a part of a union is uniquely beneficial for workers' rights, and that being a part of a union is really necessary for reform. They concede this insofar as they tell you that unions are strengthened by secondary boycotts. Their opposition case specifically says that unions are strengthened by secondary boycotts. You should specifically look towards the fact that if unions are strengthened, it means that more workers are going to be joining these unions, which means we're going to be protecting more workers' rights, which directly falls under the value. They tell you the only other response they make again is that unions won't exist without secondary boycotts, but you can look to the fact that unions literally exist in Syria. We specifically tell you that there's historical empirical precedent that unions exist in Syria, even though they already have secondary boycotts. We also we contend that the empirical analysis done on Syria goes conceded. We specifically tell you that there's a lot of reasons why Syria still has secondary boycotts and its labor force increased. When they are allowed secondary boycotts, the labor participation increased by 200,000 people since implemented. This is really important because you can cross-apply this with their arguments about decreased unemployment, because we give you empirical analysis that proves that it's the opposite. We also contend that secondary boycotts are really unique, not because they directly enhance workers' rights, but because they strengthen the union itself, and the union is what enhances workers' rights. We specifically tell you that the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics says that only 10.8% of workers are part of labor unions, which means that labor unions are right now on the decline, and secondary boycotts are another tool in the toolbox. They concede the analysis that we provide to you that it's necessary for reform because primary protests don't often solve for workers' rights abuses.
That's 5 minutes, 30 seconds.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah.
All right, good round. We'll make our decisions, and then we'll do a brief verbal RFD once both of our decisions are made independently.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
All right, we both entered decisions. So I'll just wait till both teams are back. Oh, perfect. All right. It's a good round. It was a really close round. Judge McCarthy and I actually split our decisions for the round. So
I didn't know you could see that.
yeah, no. Once the second judge enters this decision, it says how everyone on the panel voted. So yeah, really good round, really close round by definition, since two people who have been doing this for a while could vote differently. Guess, would you like to go first or
No,
should I go
actually,
first?
please go first.
Sounds good.
Thanks.
So the way that I saw it was a good round overall. There were a couple of places where both teams could improve. I think as a framing point, spending 30 to 60 seconds at the start of your first constructive, just saying this is where our main argument is for our case before going into the framework, that ends up helping the judge see, all right, this is what I'm going to do when I'm setting up the framework versus jumping right into the framework debate saying, here are advantages versus here are our disadvantages. So just as a point that was a bit separate from the round itself, a way to pick up ballots relatively easily or more easily is by just telling a judge within the first 30 seconds, here's why you should vote for me / us. And then as the last voter issue, remember when I said you should vote for us? Vote for us for that reason again. In terms of how I saw the round, I ended up voting for Gov for 2 reasons. Number one is that on weighing mechanisms, humans don't tend to function in a util environment as much as we think they do. And so the bar for me to view util as the best weighing mechanism or the best value for the round ends up becoming really high. And what Gov was able to do for me was to say voting or weighing on workers' rights or weighing on this idea of unions within workers' rights. I'll concede that union rights are different from working rights, but to me, they're the same difference. Once I decided that was my weighing mechanism, then I had to see, well, which side was better in promoting workers' rights. And once the debate became, well, which side promotes workers' rights better, the opposition case defaulted to, if we support the resolution, poverty will occur and small businesses go away. And for the entire first constructive, all I heard was small businesses are worse and poverty becomes worse and more widespread. And to me, that is a high level or high magnitude argument, but it's more of a correlational argument in the first constructive. Versus the Gov's case where it was a little bit less correlational and really just enough less correlational for me to think, all right, if I'm weighing the round on workers' rights and not util, Gov ends up getting a closer ballot than op for me. With that said, if we ran this round 7 times, we probably would also flip about 50% of the time as well. You both did well. You both deserve to be here. You both will continue to do well throughout the weekend. Judge McCarthy, it's to you.
Okay, great. Firstly, great job, guys. I actually, I think I had to write up my judge paradigm, and I would say I'm in the business world. I just kind of, I want to listen and hear, and then kind of at the end of the day, I'm like, who is more persuasive? I'm probably a little bit less technical than Jeff in terms of the correlations and all that kind of thing. And for me, I actually think that Abhi won the round for the opposition. And that was because he brought up some, what I thought was very compelling arguments that that synthesized how I ended up voting. And one was that the Gov to me sort of failed to be as persuasive in communicating why secondary boycotts in specific would do all of those great things that were outlined. And it to me that actually the strength of that and the connection wasn't as strong as it could have been. I also think that for me, the argument about the small businesses was actually very compelling. And I thought that he did an excellent job with the point of information. And for me, and even the final point about this isn't about union workers, this is about workers. I personally found it very compelling that small business workers, these neutral small business workers who could potentially be impacted by secondary boycotts, could be impacted. And if we're thinking about worker rights and not just union worker rights, I found that compelling. The other argument the Gov team brought up that I was like, yep, there you go, was that about the constitutionality and the violation of the First Amendment. And again, I thought that I don't mean to talk about one particular person. The debate, everybody did really well, but it just synthesized it for me at the very end, about the fact that, hey, you know, the difference between the individual liberties around the First Amendment versus a union and a group of people, and whether or not that is still governed by the First Amendment. But at the same time, the fact that this has been around for a while and hasn't been struck down as unconstitutional, I just felt that that was compelling. I think the government team, like, great job of kind of laying out just a whole bunch of reasons and things about unions and the importance of unions and the benefits of unions and so forth. But that's why my vote went to the opposition. I just found those arguments more compelling.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for judging. Have
Do
a
you
good
have any questions for us before we all duck out?
Yeah.
Oh,
Sorry.
yeah. Yeah, I was just going to say we didn't have any questions, but you guys can.
For the first judge who spoke, well, first of all, you know, thank you both guys. That was like really good feedback. But I was wondering whether, if, let's say, like, we better argued for the like utilitarianism perspective and that sort of weighing mechanism, how do you think you would have evaluated the debate through that lens?
I think for me, if you had any weighing mechanism that wasn't util, you probably win.
Okay.
If you had any weighing mechanism that wasn't util, and if you spent 30 seconds saying, here's why op is better than gov at the start.
Building off that question, in my LOR, I tried to do kind of a little bit of like, okay, we still win on workers' rights. Do you think there's like a way that I should have done that differently to say that I still win under their framing?
I think to me, it's more so when you win on, it's not so much winning under gov's framing per se. It's more so, what is the framing that you all would have also won on if it wasn't util? Like, I'm not saying, but also let me make it clear. Once you decided that util is the weighing mechanism, you all did the right thing of saying, this is our weighing mechanism. We're sticking through it consistently. Because the worst thing that happens is when other folks say, oh, we're going to give up our weighing mechanism. That usually never goes well, and then it leads to not good rounds all around. You all procedurally or technically as debaters did that super correct. I think to me, it was just the way the round ended up going. I leaned more towards gov than op.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for judging. Have a good day.
Thank you
Good
guys.
round.
Good luck. Really, you all did a very good job of stating